Welcome to Thorin's YouTube channel. Andrew, shut the fuck up, you piece of shit. Welcome to Thorin's YouTube channel. It's going to be a wild ride. GG, motherfuckers.
When you get players who are carrying in either straight up shit teams in relative to the top end of the competitive scene, or teams that just aren't good, they shouldn't be able to compete for championships or make deep finishes in playoff runs, I can actually sympathise with fans who don't understand. How can he be a good player if he's on this team? You know, if he's one of the best players, why isn't his team doing better? Because, you know what, these players are outliers. There's not many of them. They're very rare in history, and they really do stand out from the norm, from the mean of what you expect of a good player and where you'll find a good player in the scene. Because when you're talking about players who aren't just good players, in this case, they're the best players. They're some of the best we've ever seen, and they're on bad or lesser teams. Typically, yes, the best players should be winning or placing highly in tournaments often, most of the time. That should be the expectation. Not least because the top teams, the best teams, want the best players, and therefore, if it's viable, if you come from the right country, if you aren't an arsehole, if you're someone whose style fits, you're going to get picked up by the top teams because it's incentivized for them so that they win and they have the best chance to succeed. And as a result, you're going to make your way up to the top. Cream rises to the top, as the old cliche but accurate statement goes. So another thing you should also consider as a reasonable condition is that if you have the best player or one of the very best players or a very good player, and then he has a good team around him even, he should have an opportunity to win, a chance to win. That's it. That is a general trend in the game and most team sports, by the way. So when people look at these outliers, they think, why don't the best teams from their region want to play with them or bring them in? Does that suggest that they're not actually as good as we think they are and it's just numbers and empty calories on the page? Why don't they get surrounded by the best teammates and put in the best squad? Well, here's the thing. The thing that also makes these particular people outliers is not just their talent relative to the rest of the scene and then their teams. Normally players of their stature would have much better teams, but there's always a reason, a very good reason, in fact many reasons usually, as to why they're in that position that isn't based on like they're not as good a player or anything. That's why it's confusing, because there's nuance to it. You have to understand the context of the scene, of the politics of the scene, of how particular players' history's gone to understand why they're in this position. And crucially, it is very rarely actually about their talent. They are as good as is advertised. It's other factors that are holding them back. Typically, it's either personality related, they're either an arsehole or difficult to deal with, or they don't fit the social dynamic of a particular team. I mean, the classic Khan Forest fanatic of CS 1.6 famously recruited people in the early days based on whether they fit the kind of social ambience of the team. They didn't just go out and recruit the best players. That was the SK team that would just try and recruit the mad aimers. So it's not the case that the best teams are always recruiting the best players in that kind of a particular factor. Then you've got to also consider players make bad career moves. You see this happen in sports all the time. It happens, and so they make the wrong decision over which team to join, they turn down a particular player, they piss someone else off in doing so, and they end up like exiled for a little period of time. They end up on the outside for a little period of time. There's also just misfortune, obviously. They're players where someone might get banned on their team, or there might be a meta switch where a map goes out of the pool that their team was good on. Now their team's much worse. The map that comes in is one they never get to grips with. The scene goes more towards a tactical style and they had more of a freeform style. There's all sorts of sometimes hard circumstances that can occur that you can't account for just by looking in the server at the numbers. So let's pick out some of these great outliers who were absolutely contenders for like best player in the world, but were playing on teams that weren't even close to the best in the world, but they were elevating them to sometimes pretty good positions, you know, making major playoffs or having runs to top 4 at big international tournaments. So we'll go in chronological order. We'll go all the way back to 2014, because in 2014, you had Guardian, the legendary Slovakian AWPer of CS Source and CSGO fame, joining up with Navi, Nartas Vincer, a team originally founded and initially staffed only with Ukrainian players, but eventually just became a CIS squad. Obviously, we know nowadays they've had Flamey and Seized and these sorts of Russian players as well, and Electronic, as well as Ukrainians. It's become very much a CIS squad in that sense. But the problem here is Guardian is not from the CIS. He's not in any sense Russian culturally, in terms of heritage, in terms of his own past, in terms of his family, to my knowledge. He is from Slovakia. Now, that means initially you have to immediately look at that context. He comes from a region with no elite teams and not even any elite teams on the horizon. And especially at that point in time, we didn't have Oscar at his prime. We didn't have Sticko around as a competent player. Zero was a nobody. We didn't have any of these players around at the time that you could have reasonably made any kind of an elite squad with. But Guardian was already an elite talent. For almost day one in CSGO, Guardian was one of the absolute best AWPers and best overall players. So immediately, when you come from a region that doesn't have any elite teams, because you come from Slovakia, the country, and then the region would be basically the former Czechoslovakia, doesn't matter if you get all the former Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, and all the other countries around there, you're not going to be able to do shit with that. Hungary, Poland, whatever that sort of a region is, it's irrelevant. You're not going to be able to make a good team. Then you have to look at the fact that, okay, you know what, Na'Vi did have Seized in the lineup at the time, but Seized hadn't developed. He hadn't ripened at that point in time. Seized got really good towards the end of 2015, and then he really hit his prime for the first 6 months of 2016 when he was very, very good. Funnily enough, some of that period of time, unfortunately, was when Guardian had his injury and he himself dropped off individual form. Then you've got to look at the rest of the squad in 2014. They didn't have Flamey. Flamey joining was when they got the firepower in 2015 to become a team that could really contend and go deep in more tournaments and not just be a one-off fluke having to be hard carried by Guardian. Also, Starix was in the team, but that's the problem. He was in the team. He was a starting player. And quite frankly, when you get to the elite level of top world-class teams, he was a subpar player for that era and that game. A lot of it was carryover from his legendary status as a fantastic hybrid player in CS 1.6. Now, when he became a coach, we know he's fantastic, and that's a lot of what allowed Na'Vi to rise and Guardian to get into major finals, etc. But that wasn't the case at this point in time. He wasn't having that impact. Zeus was the in-game leader. Starix was at best maybe a secondary caller and typically just a player and not a particularly good player in terms of firepower. So Guardian's teams were massively hamstrung in terms of firepower. I mean, think about this for a second. They had within them Seized, who was sort of an average pro at the time. You had Starix, who, yes, was a smart player, but below average fragging power. You had Zeus, who still wasn't a very good fragger. He was okay, perhaps, and had this just a tactical effect. And Edward was your other player. You had to have Edward as one of your fraggers. Now, at the time, he was actually a pretty decent fragger, actually, and he wasn't just playing a bitch support role. That's the firepower Guardian was working with. So you know what? Yes, Guardian was absolutely one of the best players in the world. Now, Guardian himself hadn't quite developed to the super status that we go later. I personally wouldn't have picked him as the best player in the world. I thought there was a number of players I'd have put ahead of him. But he was a fabulous talent. But he was having to carry to give this team any chance in 2014. Then we go the next year. Oh, who's this? Another AWPer in a team that's bad with all these consequences as a result of circumstances that go beyond just the numbers in the server. Kenny S in Titan. Now, first and foremost, you have to remember, Titan was one of the top 5 or 6 teams in the world the year before. When they won DreamHack Stockholm, they beat Fnatic, the same Fnatic that went on, exact lineup that went on to become the best team of all time. LDLC, the same lineup that went on to become one of the best teams of all time and win a major. They beat these two teams back to back. But what happened? Well, the second star of Titan was not Apex. It was a player called Kaylee, who was banned for cheating by VAC and by Valve, and therefore no longer allowed to play as a professional player. And he was your second star. That was a massive part of your firepower. And you know what? At the time, I know there was that brief period where I actually dubbed Crims the best player in the world, but I have to say that's actually what really made me start to figure out the difference between most effective player and best player on one of the best teams and best player of all. Because if I'm honest, when I look back now, I think Kenny S was the best even in the latter half of 2014. Just in terms of pure player and not looking at trophies, he was absolutely unbelievable and his dominance was already really, really high level. It reminds me of when Simple carried in Na'Vi in 2017 and then the next year, this year, took the step up to be a complete god. That's like what it was with Kenny S. He was arguably the best player in 2014 and then in 2015 it was like there wasn't even discussion anymore. He was just a god for the first few months. So you had Kaylee banned. Okay, he gets banned. Right, well, we can bring a player in now. There's a slot in the team, right? Oh, what's that? The whole point is after the last French shuffle, LDLC took all the other really talented players. So what did they have to do in Titan? They went out, like my joke video, and they found fucking RPK, who hadn't played for like 2 years in CSGO, and who basically only played for the first, 4 or 5 months of CSGO? So very, very limited, undeveloped game at the time, in terms of the meta game and how you play the game. And in fact, even the spraying was different back then. And they bring him back because he's played with Existence and with these players in Titan before. And he's basically been reset as a player. And he's coming into a team that has aspirations to go deep in playoffs and make the playoffs of majors and perhaps win tournaments. They've got the best player in the world. But he's a complete bot at the time. Now he, in the years, year on year, has gotten better and has certainly learned more about the game. And I've told this story many times that I had someone help me translate in not subtitle, but give me translations for some of the VODs where you could hear the voice of the Titan players in those early days in this squad. And it's no exaggeration. Existence was having to basically micro RPK within the round, so you'd have to call the tactic, make the tactical adjustment, let Kenny S work, get ready for the floor, and he'd have to sort of help figure out for RPK where to go. Now, that's no fault of RPK's. He hadn't played the game. He was just coming in. He was thrown into a scenario where he doesn't know what to do, but he has this super smart guy with him who's been following the game and to some degree helping define some of the meta game of the Counter-Strike. So yes, obviously he's going to listen to him, and obviously it makes sense to do that. But in doing so, first of all, it's going to make RPK just decent, and so his numbers are going to look okay, but it's going to impact Existence, which is why Existence went to his absolute low as a fragger and looked like a bot, even though he was never actually a bot in terms of an overall fragger. He just had super stacked teams early and made himself all the super shit roles, and in the later days had an insane burden on his back trying to win the game tactically, yes, with the best player, so there wasn't a motivating element to it, but with an extremely large workload for an in-game leader. Then you've got to look at the fact that could we have gone another way than RPK? No, because all the other talent was already in LDLC or banned, so Kaylee banned, VeXii banned, even like supportive elements, Uzi, GMX, all these other players, they were all banned. The only player that was basically available was Scream, and unfortunately, when you already have Kenny S and Apex, there's not really a whole lot of room for Scream because he's someone you want as a star player, and he's not as great fitting into your system, and so they didn't really want that. They'd already done that. They'd been down that route a number of times within this team. Then you look the very next year. What's amazing is we've had these outliers. They're very rare. There's only 4 or 5 in history, but they come year on year. So who was it in 2016? Well, hopefully you know, because again, he came along in 2015 and he really hit his peak in 2016. Of course, it's Niko, the Bosnian sensation, who, because he's the Bosnian sensation, the phenom, a prodigy at the game, he comes from another region without elite teams or any possibility to make an elite team. Because he comes from Bosnia, and the region is the former Yugoslavia. So, even worse than not having elite teams. I mean, in Guardian's case, there wasn't international teams, except Mouse Sports, actually, from the early years, were a very different squad. And Guardian had to go and obviously learn fucking Russian and start playing with a bunch of people he didn't understand culturally or in terms of language. For Niko, he didn't have to learn another language. He obviously knew some English. But the problem here is, not only could he not play in his region, but the only international team was Mouse Sports, basically. That was the only squad that was willing to take in a bunch of outside players, partly, by the way, because they were doing it on the cheap the whole time. They were willing to compromise not having a great team in exchange for being able to do this. And so he was even joining, of all these squads I've named so far, easily the weakest thus far. I always used to make this point when Niko was a beast at the time, that the difference between him and Kenny S is even Kenny S with RPK and losing Kaylee still had more help and a better in-game leader and a better tactical style and better pedigreed players and better players for their roles than Niko did in Mouse Sports. He had easily the worst team I think I've ever seen of an elite level player who was contender for world's best. If I picked him as the world's best at certain points in time, because your good old Cold Zero at the time didn't really pass the eye test. So not only did he have to join Mouse Sports, but then because of situations with Gob B, who was the in-game leader when he joined Mouse Sports, who had his own issues with motivation and being able to dedicate himself to the game and his thoughts on what he wanted to do in the game and who he wanted in the lineup, they kicked out Gob B. And so off went the dedicated in-game leader you had, and who became the in-game leader? Some people won't know this. It was Niko himself. So this basically almost a kind of rookie in terms of playing at the top tier, came in, had to be one of the best players in the world, had to consistently hard carry, and had no motherfucking IGL, and himself had to be an IGL, and figure out how to help some not very good players play vaguely competent Counter-Strike while hard carrying as the IGL, and in his first proper year as like a true international star with the chance to go to all these tournaments and qualify, etc. Because you look at the talent in that Mouse Sports team, it was a fucking joke. The best player in the team, aside from Niko, in terms of talent and skill, was Nex. Now, as I've already talked about many times, Nex was an absolute bust at the top level. He'd turn up in terms of big tournaments like 1 out of every 5 times, and he would never play to the level that he would dominate at when you played in the Tier 2 tournaments, where he'd look really good, or in a random group stage game in a one-off best of one. But he wouldn't deliver on the big tournaments. He's even said himself he had nerve issues, and he would sometimes choke at the big tournaments. Now, in terms of actual ability to play his role and deliver, the real best player aside from Nico was Chris J. But even then, Chris J wasn't an in-game leader at the time. Chris J was an AWPer, and Chris J's AWPing style was that very inconsistent, Henny, Shazam style of AWPing where you repeat an angle a million times. And so you know what? He's going to have maps where he goes off, and then he's going to have maps where he's going to be a liability, and then he's going to have maps where he's just average. He's not a dominant AWPer like a Kenny S, like a Guardian, like these sorts of players that we think of as the traditional AWP. Actually, Skadoodle at the time was obviously a very good player. So then you get beyond those. So we've already got questionable like sidekicks or other talents in the team. Who's left? Dennis and Spiddy. Now, Dennis had actually been a pretty capable player for a few months the year before Nico joined when he was with God B. But Dennis and Spiddy in 2016 were terrible players in a number of respects. Personality, ability to fit in a team, play their roles, be competent in any sense. Fragging, not very particularly very good. What a fucking joke this lineup was. After that, we go to a player where technically in chronology, for the relevance of this, I'm mainly going to talk about when he was in Na'Vi in 2017. It's Simple. But the thing about Simple was he had a number of years where he was carrying and helping lesser teams succeed. So you go back to 2015 and he's in Flipside. Well, why is he in Flipside? Because he'd been in Hellraisers with a bunch of the talent that's now in the Gambit squad. And you know what? Guess what? He wasn't a very easy person to get along with. In fact, he could be quite an arsehole. So they didn't want to play with him. And as a result, within the CIS scene, where things definitely get around, people like Na'Vi, who were the best team in the region, they heard about these things. And they were like, well, we don't want to fucking play with this guy. Of course not. Then you were in a scenario where he went from Flipside, where he was hard carrying a very poor team, and able to do stuff like beat NIP on LAN with a stand-in in Hiko. Like on Flipside, they had a stand-in, and beat NIP, like NIP of 2015 this is. 2014. Yes. Let me think. Yeah, it was 2014. It was the SWC 2014. No, it must be 2015. Yes, it must be 2015. That wouldn't have made sense otherwise. On LAN, still a top team with some pretty good players in it. He was able to be in a scenario where he then went to Team Liquid, obviously. Now people are going to think of Team Liquid as a very good team with all these burgeoning talents. Well, why do we still keep talking about Team Liquid now? Like, no, give them time. Because Elisia's still young. Nitro isn't that old. This was a squad that, it was very, very young at that point in time. They were really young. Both Elysian and Simple were very young players, like 18 years old at the time. And what people forget is at that point in time, Team Liquid had just transitioned from having fucking Adren as the in-game leader, from having Fogley in their team. This was a squad that had never done shit internationally at this point in time. What they used to do is be good in NA, look like a solid enough team with like good chance for someone like Nitro to develop, Elise to develop, and they'd go to an international LAN, and they just get like moral victories where you play really close with VersusPro or really close with Fnatic, or you play a pretty good game against an IP, but you don't beat them. You don't win the match. You don't go deep in the tournament. You don't make the playoffs of a major. In fact, Liquid never done this. So what happens when Simple comes in? He overnight, literally, takes this team deep in majors. This is a time where Cloud9 lineups have never been to a semi-final of a major. Now, obviously, when they were Complexity, they'd been a one at the very first one, but as Cloud9, they'd never done it. Team Liquid, with Simple, goes straight to the semi-finals of the major and is in a position to win the semi-final against the team that eventually wins that major, Luminosity. Next major, he comes back, because again, tumultuous personality and player, comes back as a stand-in who hasn't even played with the team for most of the years, just played one tournament, ECS Season 1, plays with them at ESL 1 Clone 2016, takes them to the motherfucking final, beating on LAN two of the best teams of that era, the proper lineups of Na'Vi and of Fnatic, and goes to the final of the tournament, where, yes, obviously the final was poor, but it was also a terrible stylistic matchup. Now, they had no business being in that motherfucking final. In fact, if you go and look at the group stages of both those tournaments, they had no business getting out of the groups, and this guy carried them that far. Then you look when he came to Na'Vi. So first of all, Na'Vi was obviously crushed by the StarX coaching issue. They had arguably the best coach in the world, best in-game leader in the world, playing the role of the coach, and Valve stopped them being able to do it. So then they had to go to Seized, who'd briefly been an in-game leader early in his career, but was one of the best support players in the world. In becoming in-game leader, Seized ruined his own game as a support and became a fairly poor in-game leader and ruined the team's style as well. A team that had had a very structured system for many years, because obviously, to get Simple, they kicked Zeus, because at the time he was surplus to requirements. Then you had Guardian, who was lacking motivation and tanked his own personal game. Now, you can say any sort of shit you want, like, oh, maybe Simple was mean and rude. Like, that doesn't give Guardian any excuse to play like shit and not try and just, like, not put in the effort. No, you have to still have the personal responsibility for how you personally play. Then you've got to look at the fact that at the time, the org, it's not that they couldn't, they didn't want to buy out big names. And also, unfortunately, because this squad, before Simple joined, had been very good and very consistent. In fact, people always forget at the end when they had the little drop-off, because it was so just at the very end of their run, where they'd had so many top fours and finals, that people were stuck in the past. For many months, people still looked at this squad and were like, they should be so good. And here's the thing, they weren't terrible. Compared to some of the other squads we've talked about now, they had quite a lot of top 8 finishes. They were at majors making top 8s. It's just that they were never in contention to actually win a tournament. They were never in a position like deep in the semi-finals of a tournament, like, oh shit, Navi's looking good now, they might win this thing. No, that never happened. But the whole time, each year on year, as Simple was in these squads where he had to hard carry, he was getting better and better and carrying harder and harder, so that by the time he hit the end of the Team Liquid period, he was already one of the best players in the world. In Na'Vi, he was absolutely in contention for best player in the world. It's just people didn't allow it until 2018 when he went supernova, Kenny S 2015 style, and you just couldn't deny it anymore. So you think about these players, it's kind of tragic. They are outliers, and it's always other circumstances. You know, it's half those circumstances don't have anything to do with the person themselves. Nothing they chose or their own fault. So it's kind of tragic that they're so good stuck in these teams. But you know what? I'll have to admit this is a point Stu made. It's kind of compelling, right? You kind of dig it in a way, because they wouldn't have to be as great as they are if they were in a different team. They could win without that. So it allows them this crazy, bizarre platform to show you their incredible talent. Because that's another thing people won't realize. This is why these guys are outliers. Because just good players, or even sometimes very good players, but not the best, not the greats, not the people who will go down in history, actually don't carry bad teams. They might do good in certain maps on bad teams, or do slightly above the team average. They don't carry on a world-class level versus the best teams in bad teams. That doesn't happen, actually. It's very hard in poor teams. They suffer, if anything. And as a result, when they get to a better squad, now you see their level go up way more, and suddenly they're a much better player, and you go, hey, fuck, this guy's actually pretty good, isn't he? What was going on before? Like, you might watch Sonny in Mouse Sports now. This is a good example. Because to me, he's a good player, bordering on a very good player, but he's not a superstar, and he's not a contender for best player in the world, and not even the best player in Mouse Sports. You watch him in Mouse Sports, though, you'll see games and tournaments where you're like, this guy's he can be a pretty good player, right? He's a good player. Sometimes maybe he could even become a very good player and one of the top 10 in the world. Then you go and look, first of all, the maps that he has where he's not playing at that, and you go, yeah, he's just a good player. And then you go look right before that at Penta, and then the teams before, the Finnish teams he was on, he's not hard carrying these teams. He's not doing Nico and Mouse shit. He's not doing Kenny S in Titan shit, Simple in Flipside, Team Liquid. He's not doing any of that shit because he's just a good player. And actually the team holds him back and masks his skill and ability. So these players, I understand it's confusing, but the context, once you lay it out there, it makes sense. They are outliers. They are great players. They are some of the best in the world. At the time they're on these bad teams, it's the other factors that mean they have to be on those bad teams. This video was supported by Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Alex Adams, Mikkel Hansen, Bash, Daniel Yordanov, Yordan Tsenkov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Robert Baxter, Travis Greb, and a special thanks to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to get teasers for my upcoming work? Find out who's coming next, what topics are being discussed? Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest to appear on one of my shows or in one of my videos? Would you like to ask a question in my monthly Patreon AMA, or perhaps even discuss esports as part of a discussion show I run on a monthly basis? Donators can also discuss the topics expounded upon in my videos with me and the other patrons on our Patreon page. All of this and more at the Patreon link below.